Welcome on in, everyone. Grab a seat because today I'll be reviewing a movie that many people consider a summer camp cult classic slasher, which is The Burning, which was released in 1981. The Burning's a story about a prank at summer camp gone wrong, which ultimately backfires and creates a burnt, angry maniac on a mission to get revenge. The story originates around the New York urban legend about the Cropsey maniac. Something you'll notice with this movie is it has so many similarities with the first and the second Friday the 13th movies. However, the original treatment for this movie actually started before the first Friday ever even came out. Legendary effects artist Tom Savini actually turned down working on the second Friday the 13th movie in order to work on The Burning instead. And you can bet your sweet little ass that Tommy Boy gives us some pretty damn good practical effects in this movie.
The Burning came in. I actually turned down Friday the 13th Part 2 to do The Burning because Jason was running around in Friday the 13th Part 2. And as you know, there is no Jason. Jason was a kid that died in the first movie. If you watch a Friday the 13th movie past Part 1, you're stupid. Because there's no Jason. There shouldn't be a Jason. That's what I was thinking.
Filming for The Burning took place in upstate New York in the late summer of 1980. Most of the movie was shot around existing summer camps in the area to keep the costs down. A lot of the cast was local to the area and were aware of the Cropsey legend. Something also to mention is you could argue that this is the first Miramax movie ever made. The Weinstein brothers basically created this movie and were trying to break into Hollywood at the time and use horror as a way to do so, which definitely puts a bit of a stain on the movie considering that Harvey Weinstein is now going to spend the rest of his miserable damn life in prison because of all of the rape and sexual assault charges. I know I mentioned earlier that this movie is now considered a cult classic. However, when this movie came out, it definitely flopped. It only made $700,000 on $1 million budget. But the reasons are actually very similar to why John Carpenter's The Thing flopped as well at the box office when it came out, which is timing. This movie came out just a week after Friday the 13th Part 2, which is very similar to John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out 2 weeks after E.T.
Don't breathe. You're dead!
Wait, does this sound familiar to anyone else?
Thirsty for young blood.
That is weird, but I do think it's kind of funny that these movies were released just a week apart from each other. Is there a chance that somebody maybe leaked the Friday the 13th script over to the Burning production or vice versa? Maybe, but I kind of just see it as more so just a coincidence. But anyways, since the movies are so similar, it's not surprising that fans would flock towards the more well-known title of the two movies. But regardless, The Burning has aged pretty damn well, and like I mentioned, is now considered a cult classic. But now I want to talk about some things I think the movie did well. I want to start off by talking about the intro to the movie, which is all too relatable for a lot of us. A lot of us probably have memories of coming up with these dumb, elaborate pranks as a kid. I know for me, some of my biggest piss your pants laughing moments as a kid were just kind of doing these harmless pranks. And honestly, I was probably pretty damn lucky that a lot of my pranks didn't go as south as this one did. Also, yes, what happened to Cropsey is of course messed up, but I mean, it was originally a pretty harmless prank to a guy that did kind of sound like a piece of shit. Apparently, Cropsey was a drunk who even beat kids up. But to me, this is a unique way to form a revenge story for a killer in a slasher movie that is believable. It's not some supernatural killer on the loose with no motive. It's a guy who sounds like he was already miserable and is now out to avenge the kids who did this to him, or I guess any kids who remind him of them. I also think the intro is pretty damn intense and hooks you in right away as you're watching this guy burn alive. The entire time you're thinking, did this guy survive? Did these kids get away with this? Then after this, we get that scene at the hospital with the orderly breaking in the new intern, which always makes me laugh my ass off.
After you see this guy, you'll never want to come back in here again. Man, this guy's burned so bad, he's cooked. A fucking Big Mac. Overdone. You know what I mean?
Hey, it's the Whopper that's flame broiled, dude. Come on. But this guy's all talk because when the burn victim grabs his arm, well, let's just say it's going to be a code brown on floor 3 because someone just shot themselves. Another positive for me are the kills in this movie, and specifically the variety and the practical effects from Tom Savini. And this is a big reason why this movie is now considered a cult classic. I mean, anytime you've got Tom Savini behind the practical effects in an early 80s slasher, something good's gonna happen. Is this Savini's best work? Probably not, but it's still really solid. My favorite kill of the movie would just have to be that entire canoe sequence. It's definitely the biggest holy shit moment of the movie. You've got that iconic shot of Cropsey with the shears in the sunlight, and it's just a pretty damn intense scene, and I'd imagine definitely shocked some audiences in the early 80s especially. Seriously though, how long was Cropsey just laying in there? Oh, and if you've ever wondered how they pulled off Eddie's death, well, here's Tom Savini talking about it.
That was cool because, I had discovered this technique from other movies of putting a fake body on a real face. Because, I love to use the real face as much as possible. For Ned, he was kneeling down and his head was through a wall and we attached the fake body there. But it was decorated like the bottom of the boat, so it tilted the camera and it looked like, the boat, so that's how that worked.
The Glazer kill is not too shabby either, but I can't lie though, I always get a little distracted that he's still breathing right there. And it's kind of cool how they pulled this one off too. First they had Cropsey carrying Glazer towards the tree, then the shears were welded in the shape of Glazer's neck, with the tips of the shear appearing to come out of the back of his neck. I also just think the garden shears are a cool idea for a main weapon. It's something you would believe a psycho would just grab out of a garage and go on a rampage with. Next, I want to talk about the characters. And honestly, guys, the characters in this movie are some of the best characters I've ever seen in any 80s slasher. Whereas in some of the Friday the 13th, for example, you're kind of just begging the movie to kill off some of the characters as soon as possible. But in this movie, they're likable and have a lot of charisma, and you might even feel bad when they die. First of all, you've got a great character variety, funny characters, goofy characters, nerds, kids, adults, jocks, you name it. I was also surprised how solid the acting is too. Jason Alexander's obviously gone on to be the most famous person in this cast, but just does a really good job as Dave, the class clown, who genuinely does have some funny lines. I also think Todd's character does a great job playing one of the main protagonists in the story. His character is kind of an interesting one too, because on one hand, he's that pretty boy leader kind of guy who you would think would end up being pretty arrogant in the script. But on the other hand, he's also someone who genuinely tries to help the others do well at the camp, and someone you root for at the end to kill Cropsey. He also sticks up for Alfred when he gets bullied, even when he's doing dumb shit. You've also got Glazer, who does a good job as the bully in the story, and regardless if you think he's a piece of shit or not, the movie just wouldn't be as good if Glazer wasn't in the story. You've also got Michelle, who kind of plays the leader of the women at the camp, who does a good job in her role, but overall, the characters in this movie are really damn good. I also want to mention, I like that entire scene where those kids are trying to teach Alfred how to swim. First of all, the kids finally take Alfred under his wing a little bit, and then you've got Glazer trying to be suave with the ladies, and Alfred finally does get a little bit of revenge on him and shoots the pea shooter at him.
Ready. Aim. Park 'em.
Oh! Shit, what the hell was that?
Jesus, can you imagine a kid bringing one of those to camp nowadays? But overall, it's just a fun scene, and I think it helps you to connect more with the characters. Now, even though we know who the killer is in the movie does do a good job not showing too much of Cropsey until the very end of the movie. I know they did have more footage of Cropsey they could have used, but they didn't use it for this reason. Kind of keeping him mysterious keeps you engaged because you want to eventually see how scary this guy really looks. And Cropsey's face is pretty bad. I can see why the prostitute at the beginning of the movie freaked out so much. I mean, Jesus, the guy looks like a hobo's wrinkly ballsack mated with Freddy Krueger. I also just like movies that are based on urban legends, and I think in this movie they do a good job incorporating that with the campfire stories. Plus, if you camped a lot as a kid, like I did, you have some good memories of having the shit scared out of you by the older people at camp. Another positive for me is the music in this movie. You've got kind of that heartbeat theme that plays anytime we're in Cropsey's POV, which actually does kind of remind me of the music from The Thing. We also have kind of the main orchestra synth theme, which is really damn good as well, and kind of reminds me of the music from the Slumber Party Massacre. Another positive for me is just the setting for the movie. I know it's kind of overplayed at this point, but I've always been a sucker for a woodsy setting or a camp setting for my horror movies, and this movie fits perfectly into that. It just gives a perfect feel to a slasher movie, in my opinion. It also gives the characters kind of this helpless feeling because the parents are nowhere nearby and help is definitely not around the corner. So this type of a setting really creates this kind of scenario where the characters have to figure out how to get out of this nightmare on their own. And could you argue that the runtime of this movie could be cut down a little bit? Yeah, you could, but in my opinion, I think this movie at 1 hour and 30 minutes is pretty tight, and the story doesn't really have a lot of fat on it. But the intro introduces the killer's motive, the beginning builds a connection to your characters, the middle is when the killer starts his rampage, and then things really build towards the end with one final big scene. To me, it's pretty damn solid, and I can't really say much else. Next, I want to talk about Cropsey for a second, who did get pretty unlucky that Jason Voorhees in the second Friday the 13th movie basically looks like his twin brother. But I really enjoy the overall look of the character with the black leather gloves, his weapon of choice, his backstory, and just how dark and how sinister the character is. I also do think that if Friday the 13th didn't exist, well, this movie probably would have been a little bit different. But regardless, I think if Friday the 13th didn't exist, there is a pretty good chance that we would have gotten a nice little chunky Cropsey, the Burning franchise, from this movie. And lastly, I want to talk about the ending to the movie. And I like how the third act of the movie feels like it's building towards some sort of crescendo in not only the music, but what you're seeing on screen. I also like the abandoned mine for the final fight scene. I think that's a cool and unique setting. It's also one of those random things you'll come across sometimes when you're on a hiking trip or out camping in the woods. I will say though, I don't know how I feel about Cropsey using a flamethrower at the end of the movie though. On one hand, it's like, you burn me, I'm gonna burn yo ass. But on the other hand, you would think he would have so much trauma around fire that he'd kind of be like the Hound from Game of Thrones. I also like the little twist at the end that, oh, that's the reason Todd was kicked out of camp 5 years ago, because he was one of the kids that pranked Cropsey. Then to really end things, you get the little jump scare, the axe to Cropsey's dome, and then they make him an extra well done Big Mac. I also like the little second campfire story at the end.
Don't breathe. He'll hear you. Don't move. You're dead!
Next, let's talk about the bad. And I did mention earlier how great the characters are in this movie, but I think something that does kind of hurt this movie a little bit is it doesn't really have that one central character who you immediately think of as the hero in the story. In the first Nightmare on Elm Street movie, you've got Nancy. In the second Friday the 13th movie, you've got Ginny. And in this movie, I guess you could say that it's Todd, but there's just something about Todd's character. He's just not as iconic as some of the other final guys or final girls. But if it is Todd, then it is kind of actually like the second Nightmare on Elm Street movie, where you've got Jesse as kind of the final guy. And like I mentioned earlier, I definitely do like Todd's character in this story and in this movie. He definitely has a lot of redeemable factors to his character, but there's just something missing to his character, like I mentioned earlier, that makes him just not as iconic as some of the other final girls or final guys in the genre. Do I think you need a final girl to be a successful slasher movie? No, I don't think so, but there's just something with his character that makes him just not as iconic as some of the others in the genre. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but maybe it's because Todd's away at camp, so we don't really get much backstory on him. We don't get to meet his parents or his friends or really the people he surrounds himself with on a daily basis. But the same could be said with Ginny. I mean, she's away at camp as well, and she is one of the more iconic final girls in the genre. But I don't know what it is. There's just something missing with Todd's character to me. Although I will say, I think his character does deserve a lot more credit as kind of a final guy in the genre. Now, the next thing I want to point out is admittedly kind of a nitpick, but because you already know who the killer is, it kind of does lose a little bit of that mystery in the storyline, especially when you compare it to a movie like the first Friday the 13th movie. I know in this movie, the one thing you are really hanging on to is you do want to finally see what this Cropsey maniac does actually look like at the end. Like, that's something that definitely keeps you engaged. But that whole whodunit aspect, if you compare it to especially similar movies like the Friday the 13th, the original, it does kind of lose a little bit of that mystery to me in a way. But like I said, that's kind of a nitpick. It's not really bad or good. That could be a positive for a lot of people, but just kind of a little bit of a nitpick there. And here are my final thoughts on The Burning. All right, listen, guys, this movie isn't perfect and definitely has some things in the movie that do not age well. But if it's summertime, you're in the mood for an early 80s slasher movie at summer camp, you can't go wrong with The Burning. It's one of my personal favorite slasher movies of the 80s. Really, really enjoy this movie. I think it's highly underrated. Great kills, a great killer, great practical effects. You've got Tom Savini involved in the movie. Like I mentioned earlier, the characters are amazing. Some of the best characters, in my opinion, of any 80s horror movie ever. Just a really, really underrated movie. And also, I will say it, this movie is a lot better than a lot of the Friday the 13th sequels that are out there. There, I said it. And that's coming from somebody who's a huge Friday the 13th fan. But this movie is a lot better than a lot of the Friday the 13th sequels that are out there. But just overall, just a really, really good 80s slasher movie. Highly recommend it if you're in the mood to watch a movie like this. But there you go, everybody. That is my review of The Burning. Be on the lookout for new videos on the channel, which come out every single Friday. But anyways, I'm Matt McFarland. Thanks for watching. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Also, I want to mention I have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting this channel in other ways. Obviously not required at all whatsoever, but just an additional way to support this channel, help to keep these videos going. A lot of cool stuff up on my Patreon. I've got commentary tracks on there, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. I've got my first time ever watching A Nightmare on Elm Street. These are commentary tracks you can play alongside the movies and feel like you're watching the movie with me. A lot of really cool stuff on my Patreon. The link is down below in the description if you want to go over there and help support the channel in an additional way. Like I mentioned, obviously not required at all. But again, everybody, thanks for watching the video, and I will see you in the next one.